Jack had been dreaming of this trip for years. The royal city of Valdor was famous for its breathtaking palaces, historic streets, and deep-rooted traditions. Every corner of the city seemed alive with charm, as golden domes sparkled under the sunlight, and cobblestone streets echoed with the chatter of visitors from around the world. Jack stepped off the tour bus, camera in hand, ready to explore. "This is amazing," he muttered to himself, taking in the sights. The towering palace gates stood at the heart of the city, guarded by tall, expressionless figures clad in polished armor. The royal guards were a symbol of pride for the people of Valdor, known for their discipline and unwavering duty. Tourists flocked around them, snapping pictures and marveling at their stillness. Jack was a confident man, sometimes a little too confident. He thought of himself as someone who could blend in anywhere, but Valdor's culture was unlike anything he'd experienced before. As he wandered through the streets, locals greeted him warmly, but their rules seemed odd to him. Signs were posted everywhere. "Respect the royal guard," "No loud behavior near the palace," and "Do not touch the guards." Jack chuckled at the signs. How serious could they be? He thought. To him, these rules seemed exaggerated. The guards were just people, weren't they? How much trouble could he possibly get into? As the day went on, Jack became curious about the royal guards. He noticed how they stood perfectly still, no matter what was happening around them. Tourists would wave in their faces or try to make them laugh, but the guards never reacted. How do they do it? Jack wondered aloud. By the time Jack reached the palace gates, his curiosity had grown into frustration. He called out to a guard standing nearby. "Hey, you there, do you ever talk? Or are you just statues?" The guard didn't move a muscle. His silence annoyed Jack. "Come on, man, I'm just asking a question," Jack said, waving his hand in front of the guard's face. Still, there was no reaction. The crowd around the palace began to notice Jack's behavior. Some of the locals exchanged worried glances, whispering to each other in hushed tones. One man tried to warn him. "Sir, please don't. The guards are sacred here. You must show respect." But Jack just laughed. "Relax, I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, brushing off the warning. He leaned in closer to the guard, trying to get a response. His curiosity turned into boldness. In his mind, it was all harmless fun. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the palace grounds. Jack, still irritated by the guard's silence, muttered under his breath, "If you won't answer, maybe this will wake you up." And with that, Jack raised his hand, and his impulsive action would change his life forever. The slap echoed through the air like a crack of thunder, shocking everyone around the palace gates. Jack's hand hadn't struck hard, but it wasn't about force. It was about the act itself. The royal guard, standing tall and silent as ever, didn't flinch. His helmet glinted in the fading sunlight, his stoic posture unchanged, as if Jack's action had never happened. But the crowd reacted differently. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and whispers of disbelief filled the air. Some stepped back, afraid of what might happen next, while others stared at Jack with wide eyes, their expressions a mix of fear and anger. Jack, for his part, didn't seem to understand the seriousness of what he had done. He looked around, confused by the crowd's reaction. "What's the big deal?" he muttered. It was just a tap. He didn't even move. A young woman in the crowd, her face pale with worry, hurried to him. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she whispered urgently. "The guards are sacred. Touching them, hurting them, it's one of the worst offenses here." Jack laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Come on, it's not like I hurt him. He's fine. Look at him. He didn't even blink." But the guard's silence wasn't a sign of forgiveness. It was a signal. Within moments, a group of royal officials appeared, their dark uniforms embroidered with golden crests. They moved quickly and with purpose, their faces stern and unreadable. The leader of the group, a tall man with sharp features, stepped forward, and addressed Jack in a firm voice. "Sir, you are under arrest for disrespecting a royal guard," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jack blinked, stunned. "Arrest? Are you serious? It was just a joke," he protested, but the officials weren't listening. Two of them stepped forward, taking Jack firmly by the arms. The crowd began to murmur again, some of them shaking their heads in disapproval, while others watched with grim satisfaction. "He brought it on himself," one man muttered. "You don't mess with the guards. Everyone knows that." Jack tried to pull away, his confidence starting to crack. Wait. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't mean anything by it," he shouted, but his words fell on deaf ears. As the officials led him away from the palace gates, Jack looked over his shoulder at the guard he had slapped. The man stood motionless, as if nothing had happened, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Jack's heart began to race. This wasn't how his day was supposed to go. He had come to Valdor for an adventure, not to end up in handcuffs. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and for the first time, Jack felt a flicker of fear. "What's going to happen to me?" he whispered, but no one answered. The palace gates loomed behind him as he was escorted toward an unknown fate. The royal officials led Jack through the narrow, quiet streets toward the courthouse, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. He had never been so nervous in his life. The weight of the situation began to settle in, and the reality of what he had done started to hit him. A slap on the guard's face had seemed like a small thing at the time, but now, as he was escorted through the city, he understood it was much more serious. As they reached the courthouse, a large building with tall marble columns and ornate carvings, Jack's stomach churned. People outside were whispering, some pointing at him as he passed by. They seemed to be talking about him, some shaking their heads while others just stared. Jack wanted to shout, to tell them that it was a mistake, but the guard's firm grip on his arms kept him moving forward. Inside the courthouse, the air was cold, and everything seemed so official. A stern-looking judge sat at a high desk, surrounded by others who appeared to be royal advisors. The room fell silent as Jack was brought into the center. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, and the weight of their gaze made him sweat. The judge, a tall man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, motioned for Jack to speak. "You are here to answer for disrespecting one of the royal guards," the judge said, his voice clear and firm. "How do you plead?" Jack opened his mouth to explain, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. He thought of all the times he had been in trouble before, how he had always managed to talk his way out of things. But this time was different. The seriousness of the situation hit him harder than he expected. I didn't mean to cause any harm," Jack said slowly. "It was just a joke. I didn't think it would be such a big deal." The judge raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving Jack's face. "You have insulted not just a guard, but the very traditions of our city. The royal guards are not mere soldiers. They are symbols of our history and honor. A slap is not a joke in our land." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had never thought about it that way. He had seen the guards as nothing more than people in uniform, standing still and quiet. But now he understood that they were a much bigger part of the city's culture. The judge's words made him realize that his actions had deeper consequences than he had ever imagined. The room was quiet as the judge continued. "In this city, we do not take disrespect lightly. You will be tried according to our laws." Jack's mind raced. He wanted to explain himself, to make the judge understand that he hadn't meant to insult anyone. But as the judge called for the proceedings to continue, Jack realized that there was little he could say to change what had already happened. The trial moved swiftly, with little time for Jack to defend himself. He watched as the judge and his advisors discussed what should be done. Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that this wasn't going to end well. Finally, the judge turned to Jack, his expression serious. "You will face the consequences of your actions," he said, his voice final. Jack's stomach dropped. He had no idea what was coming next, But he knew it wasn't good. Jack stood frozen in the courtroom, his mind racing. The judge had just declared that he would face the consequences of his actions, but Jack had no idea what those consequences were. His heart pounded in his chest as the proceedings continued around him. He felt small, out of place, and completely unsure of what to do next. As the trial came to a close, the judge gave a few instructions to the royal officials, who then moved toward Jack. The room had been filled with quiet whispers, but now an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Jack's thoughts were a blur. What would happen to him? Was he going to be thrown in prison? Would they make an example of him? His mind raced with 100 different possibilities, none of them good. Two of the royal guards stepped forward, their expressions unreadable. One of them held up a set of iron handcuffs. Jack could hardly believe what was happening. "Wait, wait," he called out, panic creeping into his voice. "This can't be right. It was just a mistake. I didn't mean anything by it. I swear." But the guards remained silent. They didn't react at all, as if his words had no effect. They calmly moved to place the handcuffs around his wrists, and Jack realized that there was no getting out of this now. He was being arrested, and there was nothing he could do about it. His pleas fell on deaf ears, and all he could do was let out a deep sigh of frustration. The officials guided Jack out of the courtroom, through the long halls of the courthouse, and toward a side door. The cold stone walls seemed to close in around him, and his stomach churned with anxiety. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated. Just hours ago, he had been standing outside the palace gates, a carefree tourist taking in the sights. Now he was being led away in handcuffs, unsure of what would come next. Outside, the city seemed even busier than before, with people walking the streets, going about their daily lives. But Jack couldn't focus on anything other than the fact that he was about to face whatever punishment the royal court deemed fit. He caught a glimpse of the royal palace off in the distance. Was the guard he had slapped still there, standing motionless like he had before? It didn't matter now. Jack felt like the whole city was watching him, judging him, and he had no idea what to expect next. They arrived at the royal prison, a large, imposing building at the edge of the city. The stone walls towered over them as they passed through the gates. Jack was led inside, his nerves on edge. He had never been in a situation like this before. He didn't know what to do or say. It was hard to believe that this was all happening because of one small action. Inside the prison, Jack was taken to a small, cold cell. The heavy iron doors slammed shut behind him, and he was left alone in the dim light. He sat down on the hard stone bench, his mind racing as he tried to process everything that had happened. He had made a mistake, a small one in his eyes, but now it seemed like his world had turned upside down. The cold stone walls of the royal prison seemed to close in on Jack as he sat in his small, dimly lit cell. He had spent the night tossing and turning, unable to sleep. His mind replayed the events of the day over and over again. How had things gone so wrong? It had started as a simple visit to a beautiful city, but now he found himself behind bars, unsure of what the next few days or weeks would bring. Jack had tried to understand the situation, but the more he thought about it, the less it made sense. He hadn't meant any harm. Slapping the royal guard had been an impulsive, careless action, but to him, it seemed like a harmless joke. The fact that he had been arrested, put on trial, and now locked away in prison felt like an overreaction. He had seen tourists do far worse things in other countries, and they'd never faced such serious consequences. The next morning, Jack was led from his cell to the courthouse again, the heavy footsteps of the royal guards echoing through the halls as they walked. His stomach tightened with anxiety. He hadn't slept a wink, and now the weight of his fate seemed even heavier. His thoughts raced. Would the judge be merciful? Would they let him go with a warning? Or would they make an example out of him to show everyone that no one, not even a tourist, could disrespect the royal guard without consequences? When Jack entered the courtroom again, he was surprised to see a full audience. The room was crowded with people, all gathered to witness the verdict. The judge, the same man who had overseen the trial the day before, sat at the high desk, his face as stern as ever. Jack felt his heart race as he walked toward the center of the room. He could feel every eye on him, and the weight of the crowd's gaze made him feel small and exposed. The judge motioned for silence, and the room fell quiet. Jack stood before him, his hands trembling slightly behind his back, waiting for the judge to speak. The judge's voice was calm but firm as he addressed the court. "Yesterday we heard the case of the tourist who, in his arrogance, struck one of our royal guards," the judge began. "Such an act is not one that can be dismissed lightly. It is not only an insult to the guard, but to the very traditions and values of our city." Jack swallowed hard, the reality of his actions hitting him all over again. He had been told about the importance of the royal guard, but it hadn't fully sunk in until now. The judge continued, "We do not take disrespect of our sacred customs lightly. As a result, after careful consideration, the court has decided that you will be sentenced to 5 years in prison." The words hit Jack like a punch to the stomach. His mind went blank for a moment, and he struggled to process what he had just heard. 5 years in prison for a slap. He had never imagined such a harsh sentence. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, the judge raised his hand, signaling for silence. "This sentence is not only a punishment for your actions, but a warning to others. Our traditions must be respected, and those who fail to do so will face the consequences." Jack's mind was in chaos. He couldn't believe it. How had everything spiraled so out of control? He had come to Valdor with no ill intentions, just to see the sights and enjoy the culture. Now he was facing 5 years behind bars for a mistake he hadn't meant to make. As the guards moved toward him, preparing to escort him back to the prison, Jack felt a wave of regret wash over him. He had learned the hard way that in Valdor, the Royal Guard was not just a group of soldiers. It was a symbol of everything the city stood for. And now he would have to pay the price for his careless mistake. Jack sat in his small prison cell, staring at the cold, stone walls around him. The cell was dimly lit, and the only sound he could hear was the distant echo of footsteps in the hall. It had been days since his sentencing, and the reality of his situation was finally starting to sink in. 5 years. 5 long years behind bars, all because of one careless mistake. The first few days in prison had been the hardest. Jack had always thought of himself as someone who could handle any situation, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The prison was cold, uncomfortable, and silent. There were no luxuries, no comforts. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this was much worse than he had imagined. The other prisoners kept to themselves, their faces grim and their eyes filled with the same sense of hopelessness that Jack now felt. He had tried to talk to a few of them, hoping for some kind of connection, but most of them ignored him. He quickly learned that talking too much was a bad idea. The guards were strict and didn't tolerate any nonsense. He had already learned it the hard way. Jack's meals were simple: bread, water, and a small portion of vegetables. The food wasn't bad, but it wasn't exactly appetizing either. Every day felt the same. Wake up, eat, sit in his cell, wait. There was little to do but think. And thinking wasn't easy when every thought seemed to lead to regret. Regret over the slap, regret over his actions, and regret over the consequences that had followed. But as the days turned into weeks, Jack began to adjust. He started to understand the prison's rhythm. He began to learn the rules, the unspoken ones, as well as the ones that were strictly enforced. He learned that respect was everything in this place. The prisoners respected the guards, and the guards respected the prisoners who followed the rules. It wasn't much, but it was something. One day, as Jack was sitting in his cell, a fellow prisoner approached him. The man was older, with a weathered face and a deep scar running down his cheek. He had been in prison for years and had a kind of quiet authority about him. "You're the tourist who slapped the guard, right?" the man asked, his voice low but not unkind. Jack nodded, not sure what to expect. The man smiled slightly. I've seen plenty of tourists come through here. Some learn, some don't. But you seem different. You seem like you're trying to understand. Jack looked at the man, unsure of what to say. I didn't mean to cause any harm. I didn't understand their customs. I didn't think it would be such a big deal. The man chuckled softly. Most people don't, but you're in a place now where understanding is the key to surviving. The guards, the laws, the traditions, they mean something here, and once you understand that, you'll get by. Jack nodded slowly. The man's words stuck with him. He had spent so much time thinking about his own situation, but now he realized that understanding the culture around him was the only way to make sense of what had happened. It was the only way to move forward. As the days continued to pass, Jack found himself changing. He started to respect the prison's order. He began to read more about Valdor's history and traditions. He wasn't sure if it would make a difference, but he wanted to understand what had led him to this point. And as he learned more about the city and its people, Jack began to see that his mistake was more than just a slap. It was a misunderstanding of the values that shaped the place he had come to visit. Months passed since Jack's arrival at the royal prison, and with each passing day, something within him shifted. The time he had spent locked away in the cold, silent cell had given him space to think, to reflect, and to learn. At first, the weight of his actions had been overwhelming. He had felt trapped in a world that was foreign to him, unable to change what had happened. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Jack began to realize something important. He had the power to change, even in the most difficult circumstances. One of the first things Jack started doing was reading. The prison library, though small, had a collection of books that covered a wide range of topics, from Valdor's history to its laws and traditions. Jack spent hours reading about the culture he had once dismissed. He learned about the royal family's deep connection to the guard and the symbols of power they represented. He discovered the history of the royal palace and the sacrifices made by those who had protected it. Slowly but surely, Jack began to understand that the royal guard was not just a group of soldiers. They were protectors of a way of life that the people of Valdor held sacred. As Jack learned more about the city's values, his sense of guilt began to fade, replaced by a desire to make amends. He realized that his disrespect had not been just a mistake. It had been an insult to everything that the people of Valdor cherished. But instead of letting that guilt consume him, Jack chose to take responsibility for his actions. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could try to understand it. And perhaps, in doing so, he could find a way to make things right. One day, as Jack sat in the small courtyard of the prison, he was approached by the same man who had spoken to him when he first arrived. The older prisoner had become somewhat of a mentor to Jack, offering guidance and advice on how to navigate the prison's strict system. Today, the man had a different look in his eyes. "I've been hearing things," the man said, taking the seat next to Jack. "You've been reading a lot, talking to others, trying to understand the city's customs. That's good. You've come a long way." Jack smiled softly. "I had to. I didn't realize how little I knew when I first arrived here. Now I see how important it is to respect the culture of the people around you." The older man nodded. "That's what I wanted to hear. There are some people here who've been in prison for years, and they'll never change. But you're different. I can see it. You're not just passing the time. You're trying to learn and grow." Jack looked at the man, grateful for his words. "I just want to make up for what I did. I know it won't be easy, but I have to try." The older prisoner placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You're on the right path. It may not seem like it now, but your understanding, your willingness to change, that's what will make the difference in the end." That evening, Jack sat alone in his cell, thinking about the conversation. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he was no longer the same person who had slapped the guard out of frustration. He had changed, and though he was still locked away in the royal prison, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He wasn't just a tourist who made a mistake anymore. He was someone who had learned the value of respect, of understanding, and of personal growth. And that, Jack realized, was the first step toward redemption. Jack's time in the royal prison had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. The man who had walked into the prison months ago was no longer the same. He had learned so much about the culture, the people, and the traditions of Valdor. What had started as a punishment for a single impulsive act had turned into a journey of understanding. Jack had spent his days studying the history of the city, talking to other prisoners, and reflecting on the mistake he had made. It wasn't an easy process. There were times when Jack felt the weight of regret, when he wanted to give up, to let the frustration take over. But each day, he reminded himself that he had to keep learning. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape his future. The thought gave him strength. And slowly, he started to feel that he was becoming a better person. One day, as Jack sat reading in the prison's small library, the older prisoner who had become his mentor approached him. The man had watched Jack's transformation from the beginning, and now he seemed pleased with the progress Jack had made. "You're different now," the man said, sitting beside Jack. "When you first arrived, I could see the confusion and the anger in you. But now I see someone who understands. You've been learning, thinking, changing." Jack smiled, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile of peace. "I've had a lot of time to think," he said. "At first, I didn't understand why they were so harsh. But now, I get it. The guard, the traditions, it's all part of something much bigger than me. I was wrong to think it was just about one small act." The older prisoner nodded. "You've learned something important. Understanding is the key. And now, you've earned something. Respect. Not just from the people here, but from yourself." Jack's heart swelled with gratitude. He had come a long way from the angry tourist who had slapped a royal guard. He had learned to respect the city's customs, to see the value in its traditions, and most importantly, to take responsibility for his actions. He no longer felt lost in the prison. He had found a sense of purpose. But despite his progress, Jack knew his journey wasn't over. He still had to finish his sentence. He wasn't expecting to be released early, and he didn't ask for special treatment. But Jack's heart felt lighter, knowing that he had changed. The time he had spent in the royal prison had given him the chance to grow and reflect. It was a painful experience, but it had shaped him into someone who now understood the true meaning of respect. One evening, as Jack sat in the courtyard, looking up at the stars, he made a silent promise to himself. When he was finally released, he would leave Valdor a better person than when he arrived. He would never forget what he had learned in this place, the importance of respecting others, and the value of personal growth. He would carry these lessons with him for the rest of his life. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter that night, and for the first time since his arrival, Jack felt truly at peace. He had come to Valdor as a tourist, but now he was leaving with something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of the world around him, and a newfound respect for the culture he had once misunderstood. The day Jack had been waiting for finally arrived. After months in the royal prison, the day of his release had come. The decision had been made. Jack had served his time, and though he could never fully undo the mistake he had made, he had shown that he understood the importance of respect and tradition. His sentence was over, and now he would be free. As the guards unlocked the heavy iron door to his cell, Jack felt a wave of mixed emotions. Part of him was excited, eager to leave the cold, gray walls of the prison behind. But another part of him felt uncertain. He had spent so much time reflecting on his actions, learning about the culture of Valdor, and growing as a person. Now he was leaving the place that had helped him understand so much. "Your time is up," one of the guards said as he unlocked the final door. "You're free to go." Jack stood up, his legs feeling a little shaky after so long in the same small cell. He nodded, silently thanking the guard, before stepping out into the bright sunlight. The fresh air felt different, almost overwhelming after so many months inside the prison. For a moment, Jack simply stood there, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. It felt good to be free again. As Jack made his way through the prison gates, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. He had come to Valdor as a tourist, full of confidence and unaware of the customs and traditions that shaped the city. His careless mistake had led to a harsh punishment, but it had also led to his growth. In the months he had spent in prison, Jack had learned the true meaning of respect, responsibility, and the importance of understanding other cultures. The city of Valdor looked different now. The grand buildings, the royal palace, and the ever-present guards, none of them seemed strange or intimidating anymore. Instead, Jack saw them as symbols of a rich history that deserved respect. He no longer saw the royal guard as just soldiers in uniform. He saw them as protectors of something much bigger, something that had been built over generations. As Jack walked through the bustling streets, he couldn't help but notice the small things that he had missed before. The way people treated each other with kindness, the respect they had for their traditions, and the pride they took in their city. Jack had never fully appreciated these things before, but now he understood. And with that understanding came a deep sense of gratitude. When Jack reached the outskirts of the city, he paused and looked back one last time at Valdor. The memories of his time in the royal prison, the lessons he had learned, and the people who had helped him along the way were all a part of him now. He had changed. He was no longer the tourist who had made a careless mistake. He was someone who had learned from his actions and who would carry those lessons with him for the rest of his life. With a deep breath, Jack turned away from the city and began his journey home. He knew that life would never be the same. He was leaving Valdor, but he was taking a piece of it with him, an understanding of respect, of culture, and of the power of second chances.